everybody, and welcome back to Writing the Rapids, the show where I, Joe Bielecki, talk to writers about writing, and most of the time those writers have been recommended to me by people who have previously been on the show. In the case of this month's author, Dave Fitzgerald, he was recommended to me by Charlene Elsby, so if you like this episode, make sure you go back and listen to that one. Vice versa, if you liked that one, stick around for this one. Dave Fitzgerald is a writer living and working in the dank and balmy South. He has previously written for Flagpole magazine and the now defunct film website Cinespec, and currently contributes to Heavy Feather Review, Daily Grindhouse, and Cinedump. He tweets at D Fitzgeraldo, and the novel we are talking about today, Troll, is his first novel, and that's out from Whiskey Tit. Before we get into that, let me tell you how you can help the show. You can do so by signing up for my Patreon, patreon.com/noisemakerjoe. For just $2 a month, you can get these episodes a couple days earlier than everybody else. You can throw a one-time donation to me over at paypal.me/noisemakerjoe, or you can buy my book. It's called Tired. Just search for it on Amazon. Also, make sure that if you like the show, to tell people about it by tweeting or blue skying or mastodoning or whatever. If you listen on a podcast website or app that allows you to rate the show, make sure you do so. The more stars, the better. Now, without further ado, let's get into my conversation with Dave Fitzgerald. So let's start with a little chat about second person. I'm a big fan of second person, and I remember back in like elementary school when we were talking about narrative distance. Like first person is I, third person is outside of the narrator, is outside of the protagonist. And I was like, well, what is second person? And the teachers were like, they gave me kind of a wonky answer and said, well, people don't really do it. And that kind of like planted the seed in me for, as I learned more about literature. I think the first second person thing I ever read was Yannick Murphy's This Is the Water, which I thought utilized it really well, and had sort of a disagreement with a college professor at one point about like the utility of second person. I was like, and I'll still make this argument that second person brings the reader into the narrative. It pulls you in. I think in the case of like this book, it makes you complicit. And I really like that tool to like present a narrator for whom you don't necessarily want to identify with, and then say, nope, it's actually you. You are the person. And the professor said it was more like it's the narrator talking to themselves, which I think, as I've gotten less, as I've gotten away from my 20s and have been more open to new ideas, I find that I think that is a useful way to look at it too, and a good enough way to write second person. And I think that in the case of Troll can also be the case. I was talking to my wife about it, and I was like, the character is so self-centered that second person works better than first person, because like there's nobody he would rather tell his story to. He's the only audience that's good enough for himself. But I also, but the whole complicit nature of second person, I think, is like my go-to interpretation. So why did you decide to write Troll in second person? And what do you think about the form in general?
Well, that answer has gotten a lot bigger since I first started writing the book 5 years ago, or however long it's been now. I think the first like real second person novel I ever read, and the one that I think most people are most familiar with, is Bright Lights, Big City from Jay McInerney. And, that guy is, on coke pretty much the entire novel, and you're kind of complicit in his bad behavior. And I found that really, like you said, kind of you're complicit, and it's very immersive, and it almost turns the book into kind of a ride. You know, like you're with it and you're in it, and it's about you. And there's also like, you know, I mean, you can take it back to childhood, and choose your own adventure books too are very much like that. You know, you don't really get taught those or to think about them literally, but the seed of the idea is there. And then one other thing that stuck with me for a really long time that I came across completely randomly. I bought this book in a used bookstore in college called Dear Dead Person by a guy named Benjamin Weissman. And the very first story in that book is written in the second person, and you're inside the mind of a very, very like depressed, unhappy, workaday guy who's on his way home from work, and he's just miserable, and everything he's thinking about, everything he's looking forward to is this like fancy cookie in a bag waiting for him on his counter at home. And you know, no matter, like, you know, he's borderline suicidal, but if he can make it to this cookie every day, he's okay. And then he gets home and his dog has eaten the cookie, and it just like destroys him. And you know, somewhere between those two or three things, it kind of emerged as I don't know. I feel like it both draws the reader in, and it distanced me from the character in a lot of ways. Like I wanted to create this very hermetic, very isolated, alienated space where you're stuck inside his mind with him. And yeah, like he thinks a lot of himself, but he's also really miserable. And you know, he's alone most of the time. He's online a lot. He's very much like an observer of his own life in a lot of ways. And like the self-involvement that comes with being alone and high and online all the time, you know, puts you in that space. And then something that another a writer friend of mine, Tom Kendall, pointed out that it blew my mind when he said this, because I couldn't believe I'd never thought of it before. But he and I, after he read the book, we talked a lot about, you know, both of ours time smoking way too much weed, which is something that the narrator does.
Mm-hmm.
And how you kind of dissociate from yourself after a while. And, you know, you, like I said, you become an observer of your own life more than a driver of it, or a participant in it. And he thought that worked really well in that way too, as kind of, this is how he would think about himself in the second person, because, you know, he's high all the time.
Right. Yeah. And you get pulled away from your body. Yeah, I think the marijuana stuff is interesting. Another thing I mentioned to my wife is that I've been away from alcohol for like 5 years now. Mm-hmm. And still find that whenever I read about it or see it on screen, I get like the knee-jerk reaction of like, ooh, yeah, let's get back to that. Until I think for more than a couple seconds, and I'm like, oh wait, no, that's actually a terrible idea. In fact, it feels worse more than it feels better.
Yeah.
And I think I get that with like any substance portrayal in media. So I was getting that with weed too, but still got that twinge of like, oh yeah, you know, there's a dispensary right down the street. Yeah, I get a pre-roll, whatever. And then, you know, one of the utilities of the book being so long is that by the end of it, I'm like, that's right. Nope, I like being sober. I like being complete, even if it's exhausting, right? Even if I have to live inside my brain uncensored all the time, still better than that. So that was a fun aspect of how long the book was, which I think that's another thing I wanted to bring up as I was reading the acknowledgments, and you said the first draft of the book was like twice as long.
Yeah.
I find that really fascinating because I have a hard time a lot of times writing maximally. Like longtime listeners of the show will remember that like in the first year of the show I was making allusions to this novel I was writing that I was like aiming to be like 500,000 words long, and it was going to be multi-layered and stuff, and just like I can't think of that many things. I got too many ideas. I gotta like 50,000 words is like the perfect book length for me, and even that gets a little tiresome sometimes. So from the outside looking in, I ask this in a way from admiration, like how did you do that?
Oh goodness. I mean, I don't say that proudly. Like I went through a couple of other kind of false starts with other presses before I got picked up with Whiskey Tit. And the first press that showed interest was like, this is great, but you basically need to cut it in half.
Mm.
And they did me an unbelievable favor asking me to do that. It absolutely needed to be cut down. I think a lot of it just comes down to being my first novel, and a novel that I'd kind of been thinking about and taking little notes for over the course of probably close to 10 years. And once I finally started writing it, it very much became a way for me to stop smoking weed. I found that I couldn't really write while I was smoking. I had to start choosing. And, it would be a week at a time, and then 2 weeks at a time. And then, the book became more important than the smoking. And I'm really grateful for that. But they say that when you write your first book, you have everything to say, like how your whole life is fodder. And then when you write your second book, it's mostly just what's happened since the first book.
Mm.
So, like there was way too much in it, way too much of me in it. Like the book is not really about me in any meaningful way, but there's definitely we all take from our lives. The weed stuff is very personal. I do love jazz and art films and hip hop, and but that kind of comes back to the second person thing too. I feel like there's maybe something almost self-preservational about that, where I'm writing this kind of horrible version of myself that doesn't necessarily exist, but that I could imagine, and that is coming out of my head. And at the very least, I don't have to write him as I can write him as you, and he's not me.
Yeah, I like that. I like the idea that part of writing is like emptying out the unwanted parts of yourself.
Yeah, definitely.
I've talked before here and there about like method writing, and how I worry that the people who write the autofiction books that I like so much are like not taking care of themselves.
Yes.
And not taking care of themselves in service of writing the next book, right? Like, that's something I very much like don't want people to do. So I'm glad to hear that you're past being this guy, or even, the parts of you that are this guy. I think that when you were recommended to me by Charlene Elsby,
Yeah.
a lot of what we talked about in our interview was her book Psychros, and the sort of difficulty I had wanting to push back against her narrator, who was sort of twisting feminist language to justify for herself the bad things she was doing.
I just listened to that yesterday.
Oh yeah, and she recommended you to me because of similarly the unlikable narrator within Troll, who I had a much different reaction to because, kind of like what I talk about with your autofiction writers that I had just alluded to, like I can see myself having made like 2 or 3 different mistakes at some point in my late teens and ending up like this guy, or being on a similar path where like instead of watching Czechoslovakian movies because I like seeing what other cultures do with art, I'm watching it so that I can be the guy who has watched it. And I mean, indeed, sometimes there are movies I'll watch, or music I'll listen to, or books I'll read because I feel like I should, right? I'll say, man, I'm really into art films, and everyone's saying I need to watch Harmony Korine, so I'm just gonna watch Gummo. And it doesn't matter if I enjoy it or not. I just like need to tick off the box.
I think that's something a lot of people feel.
Yeah.
With so much available to us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Going down the list.
And I feel like that's what a lot of this guy's problem is, at least with regard to how he treats media, is like, how are you watching all these movies and not learning anything?
Yeah.
Like, how have you not figured out? Because he'll even be talking to somebody and he'll be like, oh yeah, this French director says so much about our society. And like, yeah, what does he say? And how does that compare to how you are living your life? And there's no self-reflection. I kept being bewildered with this guy that, like, how do you spend so much time thinking about yourself and also be unable to reflect on yourself? Like, how does that happen? And then obviously I was 16 once, and I'm sure I was very much just like this guy. Spent too much time on 4chan and have your brain rotted a little bit. But yeah, I think the use of media in this book is really interesting, and I'm curious to know, like, what with all the references in there and the friend's essay near the end, kind of like what your relationship to visual pop culture is.
I mean, I hope I'm a little more reflective about it than the character is. I have I love film and television. I watch a lot of stuff, not as much as I used to, but that definitely that high and low culture dichotomy within him is something that I enjoy. Can you be a little more specific?
Let's see, can I?
I think I'm trying to kind of explore media as just another addiction with him. Like, that kind of need to see everything and be able to speak to everything, whether or not you necessarily understand it or absorb it. And what we were saying just a second ago, just like ticking the boxes.
Mm-hmm.
He always wants to be the smartest guy in the room. He always wants to like be seen as knowing the most, even if he doesn't necessarily.
Right. Yeah, I think there's that. I mean, you can see it pretty early on that he kind of catalogs. I have this many movies and I've watched all of them, and this many books and I've read this many of them. And then just spends 8 hours watching Friends.
Yeah. Which is something that you hear people talk about today is like, I'll spend half an hour scrolling through all the things I could watch on Criterion and then just watch an episode of Friends because it's comforting and I can't make a decision.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I also think there's like a whole subsection of a generation, maybe my generation, that kind of, the last generation to grow up not entirely online,
right,
that kind of defined themselves through cultural capital, through like knowing about this stuff and being able to speak about it and quote it. And then suddenly it was available to everyone, and what they had accumulated didn't have the value that it used to. And they don't really know what to do with it anymore. Like the idea of completism, that is pretty much impossible now because you would just go insane trying. But some people do. I know people like that who just are continuing to try to keep up with everything, and it's not like physically or psychologically possible.
Yeah. It's such a strange thought. To go from like the kid in high school who thought Eraserhead was really cool to then being on Twitter a decade later and people are talking about some French director who's just like no idea, right? No, and is doing like weirder stuff. And there's that interaction in the video store where he's talking to like the millennial Gen Zer 20-year-old who's just like, oh yeah, what about surrealist films, and names like the second guy after Breton if you know about surrealism as an art movement. And like I think it's funny and want to scoff at that guy, but it's like I haven't seen any Buñuel films either. I particularly found that interaction really hilarious, because the narrator's like swinging his dick around and he's like, you wouldn't have half the films in here that you do if it wasn't for me. And the guy's like, oh, that's right, everyone here hates you. Like nobody's impressed. Nobody's impressed that you made us get these Region 2 Greenaway DVDs.
That was a fun scene to write.
I bet it felt like it would be fun. I think one of the strengths of this book is the dialogue.
Thank you.
You're welcome. I have a hard time writing dialogue, and especially like speeches. And there's a lot of good speeches in this book, and it feels good to kind of see the discussions that play out online happen in prose, where I don't have to click through a Twitter thread. And like his date with Elle is really satisfying, where you can tell he's got strong feelings about something, and then you have somebody sitting there across from him saying like, okay, well, tell me more, right? That same thing that I just said about like so and so director has so much to say about our society. It's like, cool, yeah, what does he have to say about it?
I think about that moment the first time they meet, where she asks him what his screenplay is about. And he's like, well, it's kind of like Tarantino, but it's got a little Ryan Murphy thrown in, but not in a serious way. And she's like, okay, but what's it about?
Mm-hmm.
And he doesn't really have an answer.
Yeah. There was a meme I saw today where it was like a person running away from two people in a golf cart. And the person running was labeled writer, and then the golf cart people were, what's your book about? And then the other person was name 2-3 comp titles. And I think that there's something there about like you're writing to sell something rather than writing something and then figuring out how to sell it afterward.
Yeah.
Also, that screenplay, I'm so glad stayed in the book because it was hilarious. I want to see that. I want to watch that movie because it's like there's the distinction of camp, right, where it's like somebody's trying really hard but failing, and that's a good campy movie, and somebody trying to make a bad movie and succeeding is not campy and it's just a bad movie. And you nailed it, man. You nailed like actual camp. Like I believe that this person thought this movie was good, and I believe that he wrote it and did his best. And I laughed out loud reading it aloud.
I would love to see it too. Knock on wood.
I enjoy, and I think that's kind of where the length comes from, is you do these diversions, like the Friends essay or the screenplay, or even just kind of him planning out other essays, his Tarantino essay and stuff like that, that I kind of enjoy and also feels kind of weedy, right? Like you get into that like head loop thing where you're just like going down a road, and before long you kind of forget what's going on, but you have a vocabulary set up, like you have a little bit of context still, and so you're just kind of like running the wheels until you feel like you're there. And then at the end of it, it's like, wait a minute, what did I even talk about? What is even going on? And yeah, I thought that was good too, because some of those diversions, you can see that he is at least talented in the fundamentals of like media criticism. Like you can tell that he actually like did retain some of the information from the books he's read and the movies he's watched. And then just like doesn't synthesize it effectively.
Yeah.
And as a reader, it's so fun to be so frustrated. Just like, oh, just do a little bit more.
Yeah, it's also analytical. It's like he's always trying to say the right thing instead of, what he actually thinks.
Yes. That's okay, cool. I'm glad you said that, because was something I was trying to work out in my brain, like what is happening with this character, where he's not like unaware of how people act.
Mm-hmm.
He's just only taken in bad information about what to do about it.
I like that.
Like his 3-day rule. Oh
yeah.
He has a good conversation with a woman who gives him her phone number, and he's like, well, I saw in How I Met Your Mother that you're supposed to wait 3 days, so I'm gonna wait 3 days. Like, no, she wants you to talk to her more. Just go talk to her more. The amount of opportunities that you have given this character for him to bungle every single one of them is just outstanding. I thought the character Claire was really interesting too, because she kind of seemed like the female answer to him.
Yes. Thank you.
Okay, cool. So talk about Claire a little bit.
Well, I mean, the three women are, very important to the story. It's a little bit of a Goldilocks setup.
Mm.
One's, a little too innocent.
Mm-hmm.
The other one's, maybe what he thinks he wants, but he can't really handle it. And then he finds Elle, who's, just right, perhaps. And, he absolutely shoots himself in the foot. But, Claire, I think, is definitely kind of the female match. She's very cynical. She's absolutely as like media savvy and smart as he is, probably smarter than he is. And a lot of what she says to him during their time together, it is maybe what he imagines that he wants when he's sitting at home watching porn, thinking like he's this big swinging dick or whatever, and and then and without giving too much away, it turns out to be very much the opposite. Like he can't deal
Mm-hmm.
with the realities of his fantasies. No, the Claire chapter has come to be my favorite chapter in the book. The only reason I don't do it at readings is because I don't want to give too much away up front. But yeah, she was a blast to write, and both her and Elle, I feel like, are kind of the heroes of the book a little bit.
I think so too. I think that Elle is an interesting character because she's such a normal person. But has that interest in more esoteric media.
Mm-hmm.
But just because like she saw it one time and thought it was good. Her reaction when he's like, "Oh yeah, I watched like every single one of that director's films between then and now," and is like, "Oh, okay." like got this like perfect read on what's happening there, especially after his terrible Disney take. It's like, okay, yep, nope, you just watched those movies to impress me. You are not that excited about film. So it's time to text my friend and tell her to call me.
Yeah, he throws up a lot of red flags over the course of that evening.
Yeah. I would be really impressed if somebody came to me and actually had a good case for like the classic animated Disney films are harmful to the boys who watch them, and had like a good thought behind it, right? Because there's like something you could say there about like disposability, or how like men, even though they have or agency, are like ultimately anonymous to like the grand narrative creators and are just utility, or something, right? And instead he was just like, no, but like women are actually hard work to make happy. TV told me all I had to do is, show up. And it turns out that you actually have to have a personality.
Video games too.
Indeed. So the term transgression kind of popped up while I in my brain while I was reading it. There's, I think, in this writer's ecosystem that we're in, you kind of come across these people who seem to want to say that like I'm writing transgressive fiction as a means of just figuring out like the most gruesome thing they can write and then writing it. But I felt like Troll was like kind of something you could describe as like a transgressive novel, like a good modern transgressive novel. And I'm curious if you have like any thoughts about transgressive literature, or contemporary transgressive literature or anything like that.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a place for the hyper gory stuff. I mean, even Charlene's most recent book has some pretty horrific stuff in it that I think is really powerful.
Yeah.
Um, but no, I came to it kind of differently. I grew up in a really conservative home, and kind of everything. A lot of what I wanted to read and watch and listen to growing up was always kind of a fight or a secret.
Mm-hmm.
And that could be anything from say Nabokov. Like I read Lolita in secret, or A Clockwork Orange. Legitimate classics.
Right.
And then something like Eve Ensler or Gloria Steinem, Outrageous Acts and Everyday Rebellions. I read in secret because feminism went against kind of my religious upbringing in the same way that ultra violent films might have.
Right.
So, but there was always this kind of sense that important information was being kept from me, and anything that was taboo was inherently important, and that I had to kind of seek that out if I wanted to be, quote unquote smart or whatever.
Right.
And yeah, the older I got and the further from home I got, and the less I had to worry about anybody keeping tabs on that, the more that just like continued to flourish. I didn't really get into the horror stuff until like well after college, and it's still not my favorite. I'm much more interested in like emotional and psychological trauma and the ways that people hurt each other than I am the creative ways that we kill each other.
Sure.
But yeah, I don't know. I do think Troll is a pretty transgressive novel in a pretty like everyday kind of way. I really had a lot of fun like playing around with the insidious language of pornography and the way that kind of can work its way into our everyday thought processes about sex without us necessarily noticing, just because it's so pervasive now. I wanted those sequences where he's watching porn. I really wanted to describe it in a way that was like sexy but also gross, and kind of split the difference there, and really make you think about what he's actually watching and how it's very different from just like a normal healthy sex life.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you succeeded with the porn stuff, making it both sexy and really disgusting. I was thinking, it's been years. It's been over a decade since I've read Catcher in the Rye. But I had recently just watched one of the cozy booktubers my wife and I watched together on the weekends. Recently she just read Catcher in the Rye, and I was kind of thinking about Holden Caulfield going off to New York and calling everybody phonies. Mm-hmm. While reading the first section of this. And then I was also thinking of American Psycho as a sort of antithesis to the narrator of Troll, because Patrick Bateman is kind of like an empty person who's trying to see if there's anything there. Mm-hmm. Whereas the narrator of Troll has substance but refuses to nurture any of it.
Yeah.
So did you think about either of those books while writing it, or were there other sort of...
American Psycho, definitely. I would count that as top 2 or 3 influence. I thought about it a lot, and it had a huge impact on me when I first read it in college. Uh, I think it's a masterpiece, and at the same time, it's hard to say that I liked it because it's really hard to read. But I think what really kind of got me fascinated with it over the years was a kind of a fan theory. I think that the murders are not real, that they're just his fantasies, and that he's very much this kind of like impotent corporate cipher, and he's just like a product of this hyper masculine culture that he's in, but he's not actually doing any of this stuff. It's just all in his head. And whether that's true or not, that it was part of the discussion was really interesting to me and made me think a lot about like the idea of the internet troll. This guy who's thinks he's big and bad and destroyer of worlds, but is really just sitting at home alone typing on his computer. And yeah, he may do some real world harm, but it's pretty limited,
right?
In the end, or at least, and the definition of the word troll has changed a lot, even in the time since I started writing this book.
Yeah.
What it means today is very different from what it meant in 2016 when the book is set. But I thought about Patrick Bateman a lot. As for Catcher in the Rye, I haven't read it since high school. I will say the guy in charge of the first press that picked up the book was quick to compare it to that. And I took that as a compliment, but I would have to read it again. I just don't remember.
Me too. My senior year high school AP English teacher was like constantly trying to get me to read Catcher in the Rye. And she's like, "Oh, you'd love this book. You'd love this book."
Oh no.
And so I read it like almost immediately after graduation, and I was like, and it's dawned on me more and more the farther away I get from myself as a 16, 17, 18-year-old, where it's like, "Oh, was I insufferable?" It's interesting because like I hated Holden. I thought he sucked. And I think I didn't pick up on some of the hints at like abuse that he was the subject of, that sort of touched on at the beginning of the book. I think I really didn't pick up on that because, again, that booktuber that my wife and I watched, she was like, "I really feel bad for Holden because you can tell that he's been twisted due to these experiences that have happened before the events of the book that are touched on." And, one, I haven't had any of those experiences, so I have no excuse. And I didn't pick up on that. So it was one of those things where I read it and I was like, "Oh no."
But don't you think, again, I haven't read it in a long time, but I kind of think if Holden read Catcher in the Rye, he would hate Holden.
Right.
Like, I think a big driving force behind the troll character is that, he hates everybody, but really he kind of hates himself.
Yeah. And you get moments of that you put in, like, I have to cover up how trash I really am. I have to disguise myself before I go on a date with this girl and things like that. And, yeah, I think there's something to it. It's such a short book. I have a hard time rereading things because I have a list of books that I own that I need to read that's too long anyway.
Yeah.
But
I should definitely read it.
It seems like it would be useful to kind of go back over it now that I'm older and a little bit kinder to myself and other people, to kind of gather what's going on there. Because I liked your thought that you had there just recently, that the definition of troll has really changed, because the narrator is really kind of the end of an era. of internet denizen, where like up until probably about 2014, there was the mantra of don't feed the trolls. There are people who are on the internet, and the way they use the internet is to try to get a rise out of you. And they're easy to identify, and they're easy to ignore. Don't take the bait. Just ignore it. And I don't know what happened to make it so that the people who were trolling either became or replaced by actual racists, right? Like, there's the people who do racism, and then there's the people who are racists. So I don't know like how these trolls went from the people who are participating in the project of white supremacy and misogyny, and became or were replaced by people who are those things and would identify as those things, at least in private. I don't know if it's like our fault. Like, did we feed the trolls too much? Is it like a gremlin sort of thing? Did we feed them after midnight and they realized that there was money to be made? Or what? Like maybe YouTube monetization did it, right? People realized that, just making new atheist content was fun because it pissed off the Christians, but once you could start getting AdSense from it, that let's follow the money. Or
I think probably a certain amount of radicalization, probably a certain amount of just like establishing a playbook that worse actors could follow. Honestly, I have never been terribly online. So a lot of this is completely made up as far as I'm concerned. Right. I didn't really start doing Twitter till like 2.5 years ago. Ironically,
you joined at the best time.
So, I maybe can't speak to that as well as some people might could, but I read about it tangentially,
right,
as like a phenomenon, and it stuck in my mind as like what makes people behave this way,
right. I wonder if that's covered in that Kill All Normies book that has like haunted me like a specter.
I don't know that.
It's published by Zero Books. Angela Nagel. It's called Kill All Normies: Online Culture Wars from 4chan and Tumblr to Trump and the Alt-Right. So maybe it actually kind of answers those questions. It's one of those books, every once in a while, you come across a book and you're like, that has good information in it, but I know it's going to make me so angry to read it.
Yeah.
Like I still haven't read The New Jim Crow. Like I just know that it's going to be so infuriating to read, that I keep putting it off and putting it off and putting it off. Because like I know that I don't need to be convinced of anything, so I know that I'm just going to be giving context that's going to weigh on me, and so I'm going to use my privilege to say nope. I'm gonna wait. I'm gonna wait until I have nothing else to read, or until I finally become brave enough to really dig into it. But for your sake, I'm glad that you're not haven't been super online, because I think that outside is a really nice place to be.
I do think that a lot of it does come back to the addiction thing, like whether it's a drug or media or outrage or like the click of the tweet button. Like we're all just kind of doing the things that make our brain chemicals do what we like them to do, and so much of the world is streamlined to addict us to things now that I think if everybody takes a good step back from their life and looks, they're probably addicted to something. And,
yeah.
Trolls definitely grew out of that.
Yeah. The Buddha would be very disappointed. But yeah, I think there's something to that. it kind of felt like an epiphany to me when I realized that like depression is addicting.
Oh yeah.
And I mean, clearly, you know, it's hard. It was hard for me to, and I think maybe still is, to like blame the internet as an object of addiction, right? Like, because I really liked World of Warcraft when it was big and popular, and I'd like watch the documentaries about people who are addicted. And my response as a kid who like didn't have his own computer and was just using the family computer to play WoW was like, I simply wouldn't play World of Warcraft 14 hours a day. And it's like, of course, you don't have the opportunity to. You have a brother who wants to play, and you have parents who want you to do homework and all that. So like, there is, you know, every once in a while you have that day where it's like, have I been on Instagram for 6 hours? Why do I feel so bad? And I, you know, there's definitely like, we don't know like neurology very well as a general sort of baseline populace. Like there's not like, maybe there is and I haven't found it, like good verifiable information that's like, when you tweet, this happens in your brain. And so like, here's the safe number of tweets to do in a day. Or like, I don't know, like even a ratio. Like if you get 6 likes per tweet on average, then you should tweet no more than 4 times a day. And if you're a famous person, 1 a day is the most or whatever. But yeah, you know, it's kind of the fear of every science fiction writer out there that the technology has outgrown us, or at least our capacity to handle it, which is a bummer because, you know, I don't want old people to be right about that. I wish I could handle it. But obviously, you know, if you gave me a car that could drive 400 miles an hour, I'd crash it immediately. Oh, I like the whole section in between the wedding scene and the real date with Elle, where he completely flips in how he treats people, to an unhealthy degree even, and in such a way that it probably feels disingenuous to the people who know him on a daily basis. But he's like nice to like a couple people at the beginning of the workday, and people immediately start treating him different. And he's like, wait a minute, could I have just done this the whole time? Which I find really fascinating. But it's still, there's that element that I think we touched on earlier of like, he's only acting in a way because there's an expected outcome of the action. And there isn't like that knowledge of self of like, these are the things I enjoy talking about. This is the amount of small talk I enjoy. That I think is missing from the sort of self-help culture.
Okay.
So let's see if I can, if I'm in an Elle date situation where I'm just going to stick my foot in my mouth, or if I actually have a good thought here. So hold on. The idea is that like, and this is like my interpretation of what self-help and the Dale Carnegie How to Make Friends and Influence People sort of pop psychology stuff works, where it's like, if you treat people like this, they will respond to you like that. Whereas there isn't that, at least in the most popular stuff that seeps into the culture so that people who don't read those types of books can interpret it. There isn't that like, know yourself so that you can be genuine with people. And that's a good way to meet people, because if you're genuine, the people who are receptive to that are going to be people who are going to be easy to be around, sort of thing. And I don't know if like the the narrator of Troll knows who he is in a genuine sort of way to do that. And so he does just this sort of like Nightcrawler-esque, like Jake Gyllenhaal Nightcrawler-esque.
Yeah, I knew what you meant.
Sort of like, I took a 6-part YouTube video lesson on how to make friends, and this is what I'm gonna do. I don't know how much sense that made.
No, I got you. Yeah, I don't know. I feel like the 2 chapters that you're talking about, for me, are a lot more about him being sober for the first time in years. And there is that kind of, really super high 3 or 4 day period right after you really get something out of your system where you feel kind of almost superhuman. And like everything's coming up roses. You can't do anything wrong. Like he's happy to talk to people. The sky's a little bluer. He's better at writing. His brain is functioning in ways that it hasn't because he keeps it dampened all the time. And then, that inevitably wears off, usually inside a week. And then you start to remember why you were smoking weed all the time. It's like, it's not really like this. As far as his interactions with other people, I think they're just a product of that kind of, it's almost like a manic depressive kind of dichotomy. Or like, if you've known someone with that condition and spoken to them in the manic stage, they can seem like a completely different person, for a little while. And then, the crash comes.
Right. Okay. That's interesting. Thinking back on it, I see where that's coming from. And that makes sense. I think it's for me a matter of just like having been away from unsobriety for so long that it's hard for me to like consider that. But like, yeah, that makes total sense that like that's a big part of it. And thinking about it, like, yes, you definitely do like point to it kind of specifically too.
And the high of kind of like infatuation too.
Mm-hmm.
Like he's very much this kind of guy who will go from nothing to I've met the love of my life, in a single night, which is absurd.
Mm-hmm.
There's this great essay that I have thought about a lot in my own life over the years. I definitely thought about a lot while I was writing him, from Chuck Klosterman, the Sex, Drugs, and Cocoa Puffs. I think it's the very first one in the book. And he writes about how he's alone, and he's been alone for a long time, and he's kind of given up on finding real love because he only wants movie love.
Mm-hmm.
And he knows that it doesn't really exist, so he can't have it. So he's just kind of screwed.
Yeah.
And I think in this moment after the wedding, the troll feels like he's actually found the movie love that he didn't think that he'd kind of given up on.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of men, can cop to having been there, especially in their younger, dumber years. I certainly have. But you hopefully grow out of that. He hasn't.
Right. Yeah. And yeah, that's interesting. Because I mean, like, even the setting of like meeting her, right? She kind of appears out of the crowd, and then they go outside away from everything, and they're sitting, and it's quiet, and they're sharing cigarettes and talking about like, a deep interest.
Yeah, it's it's the only chapter like it in the book for a reason. It's supposed to feel kind of magical and ridiculous at the same time.
And it does, and it makes what happens afterwards so much more painful for the reader, because I'm like, maybe this is it. maybe this is enough. Maybe he will see her and understand that she's a full person and he's been wrong, and he just needs to like slough off all those dumb Reddit threads he's read, and emerge a real person, a man who lives in the world. And obviously, that's not the case. And like, you can see it coming. I think there are things about book length that can really work well with regard to pacing, because like, I'm at a certain point in the book and something really good is happening and there's so many pages left, and I'm like, this isn't going to just turn into like him becoming a good person in the next 200 pages, is it? Like, it can't be. Like, I hope it is. I hope that's what happens. That would be really rewarding. But I feel like the book would be called different, and I feel like the cover artwork would be different. And there's just, as much as I want that to be the case, the book's too well written for it to just cop out like that. So it's probably going to be bad. Okay. And you resign yourself to it.
I'm so sorry.
And it's great. Like, I love that about books. It's kind of the same reason why I do like the gruesome stuff. And because like, it's like being in a haunted house and you just know something unpleasant is going to come, but it's fun to anticipate it, and then it's a nice relief when you're done with it. So you keep walking through the haunted house until the zombie pops out, until a 14-year-old working for $8 an hour pops out and screams and scares you, and then you continue. But it's so much more drawn out, and like, it's so good. It's so good because it's so exhausting. I wanted to real quick kind of bring up on a more like sentence level the writing style here, because the book is long because a lot of things happen in it, but I feel like it's long also because it is, and I say this really lovingly, it's kind of overwritten. I had to look up so many words, and there's so many references. It's so dense. And I feel like that's because it's the character telling the story, and he's trying to like convince himself that he's smart, or convince you, the reader, that he's so smart. So he's using all these, what's the term? Like $3 words.
$3 words, yeah. $10 words.
Which was cool from a narrative thematic point of view. Like, it really made it feel like it was the narrator, gave him his own voice. And it's also useful because I like vocabulary words, and it was way better than a word a day calendar. But
that's actually that was a tool in creating the character.
Good.
I had word a day calendars, and would pull from those to make him like that kind of erudite way that he speaks.
Yeah.
And he thinks like someone who's online all the time. Everything's a reference. Everything's, makes him think of something else. It is overwritten because his mind is overtaxed. So this is going to be at the beginning of episode 4. And he's just come home from work and is, getting ready to relax and spend an evening alone, smoking weed, watching TV, the way that we've been talking about during the interview. So here we go. You realized a long time ago that you like TV more than most people. Now, this is not to say that you like TV more than most people like TV, though that is also almost certainly true. but rather that you like watching TV more than you like most people. Between your work computer and your home screens, you spend nearly 2/3 of every day in communion with the digital world. You are Cypher. You may have accepted the red pill once upon a time, but you've been looking for a way back to the blue ever since. You're not just aware of the Matrix, you believe in the Matrix, evangelically. Sure, the little playlets you enact outside your various hard drives and streaming services change from time to time, but your inner life is plotted to perfection. Fuck Zion. The Matrix is real, and Neo can blow you in bullet time. Your house winces as you step onto the Conestoga hardwood, shut the door, and quickly exfiltrate yourself from your clothes, loosing a cavernous dubstep belch in the direction of the great Irene Jacob, who, already looking chilly in your original French language poster for Christoph Kieslowski's Rouge, appears to shiver a bit as she flutters away from the wall. You consider her place one of honor, as nearly every other inch of vertical real estate is occupied by a chock-a-block Tetris grid of secondhand shelving. Squat dorm bookcases sit atop low console units, which buttress teetering particle board towers whose upper floors are stabilized by homemade, cut to fit 2x4 shelves, with knockoff IKEA cubes filling the odd nook and cranny, all in service of keeping somewhat organized your perpetually isotropically expanding media library. At last inventory, your shelving plexus housed around 4,000 DVDs, all of which you've watched, 3,000 LPs, about half of which you've listened to, and nearly 5,000 books, maybe a tenth of which you've read. Maybe. Woody Allen to Robert Zemeckis, Cannonball Adderley to John Zorn, Douglas Adams to Howard Zinn. Yours is a methodical kind of madness. Entertainment functions like any other drug, and for your woefully average American upbringing, that meant getting hooked young on Disney and Star Wars, your first fixes amidst a childhood spent rabidly suckling at the boob tube. Middle school brought the candy cigarettes of SNL, Monty Python, and Mystery Science Theater 3000, and your first real cigarette by way of a secrecy sworn sleepover screening of Porky's, before you dove headlong into a morbidly curious teenagerhood of shotgunning natty lights with Stallone and Schwarzenegger, and deadening your senses with Ditchweed and Jay and Silent Bob. By college, you'd graduated to the hard stuff, downing stiff double shots of The Shield and The Sopranos, taking epic bong rips of Greenaway, snorting Kubrick by the kilo, and shooting Bergman directly into your eyeballs. You've always been this way. All highs point somewhere higher, and all depths lead somewhere lower. The promise of ecstasy and depravity in equal measure, forever just around the next bend. The next album, the next film, the next hit. In essence, your whole life is a wiki hole. If you'd ever had the balls to try smack or meth, you'd surely be long dead by now. The more you know. The entire shoddy apparatus shudders under your heavy footsteps as you lovingly run your hand along all three walls of stringently abecedarian spines before heading to the couch and flipping on the fourth. With ESPN blathering in the background, you turn your attentions to Blaise Pascal, the diminutive glass pipe you emptied this morning. The art of packing a bowl is subtle and underappreciated. Though not as sexy as the joint or its gluttonous cousin, the blunt, the bowl prizes economy above all. Finely attuned to your own tolerances, you craft every hit with mathematic precision and conveyor belt uniformity, twisting 3 pea-sized nugs between the tar-stained teeth of your grinder with the dispassionate brutality of an Iron Maiden. Grinding your weed provides for a more even, controlled burn and allows you to dole out prescription hits with Hippocratic discretion. You've even adopted the practice of dividing each new sack into a color-coded 2-week pill planner. The brass screen is over a week old. You'll need to change it soon. But for today, the smoke still flows freely between its ash-crusted apertures and upward into your skull. You are a honey-baked ham. While the first hit of the day is always the best, the first hit of the evening is never far behind. Embracing you with the tenderness of a doting, naked beneath her apron housewife, it stills your fidgety digits and demands your lips' attentions again and again until you both collapse, sated and spent, and sink into the magic hour. Where the first hit of the day is your suit of armor, the first hit of the evening is your silk pajamas. where the first hit of the day is your espresso shot, the first hit of the evening is your glass of oak aged red. Regardless of whatever came before it, in a single moment, it makes absolutely everything okay again. Suddenly, your dim hovel is rendered a symphony of cleanly wonder, as if transformed by a wave of the Fantasia Sorcerer's wand. What seemed mere hours ago like the wholesale contents of a Waffle House kitchen Akira-ing their way out of your rancid refrigerator is now a delectable smorgasbord of dinner options to rival the feasts of Heliogabalus. What often feels like a desultory, Kansas monochrome life is plunged into Ozian Technicolor, with nothing ahead but miles of yellow brick road and only the occasionalist of commercial interruptions. And so you begin your nightly journey, up the dial and into the ether. Roger Federer smacks an ace across some poor snap's schnoz. A well-coiffed African-American woman warns of a sexual predator. Ross, Chandler, and Phoebe sip syndicated coffee. A couple examine a brownstone with an overzealous realtor. DeVry University offers you a sad fresh start. An NCIS CSI SVU agent makes an off-color pun on the word stiff. A Honda vehicle is declared both luxurious and affordable. An edited for TV Samuel L. Jackson demands his mutual fund in money. A model nearly jiggles out of her demi-cup as she gorges on a Western bacon cheeseburger. You pause momentarily. A nervous man misses a Jeopardy question. Smooth jazz plays over a weather map, and so on. You circle back to the Friends rerun as you've been working your way haphazardly through the series for something like the 10th time, and have come to find the vocal rhythms and telegraphed punchlines as soothing as steady rain or ocean waves. You know them all by heart, but still chuckle at every suave, "How you doing?" or exasperated, "I know." And while you tell yourself you're doing research for a long gestating polemic, in your heart you still want to love the Friends more than you want to hate them. Theirs is a near perfect fantasy, the kind that never seems too far-fetched until you really start to think about it. No matter how cynical you become, they will always be there for you. You finish off your bowl with a coughful of quick, sequential puffs and hold them in until you cough up thick, frayed ropes of hemp. Finally tranquilized, you shamble to the bathroom to pop out a few compact rock tumbler poops and stroll through the kitchen to retrieve a mucosal styrofoam container of Mongolian beef and a family-sized bag of Cheetos. As you return to the couch, your gently drifting mind notes a striking resemblance between Chester and the outlaw tobacco mascot Joe Camel, and you wonder if he'll someday meet the same societally mandated excommunicatory fate. They're both essentially cartoon drug dealers, after all, luring kids into their deviant vans with purred promises of tinted glass cool. Your couch sits only a few feet from your TV, close enough to letterbox your peripheral vision and dive in like Captain N. Tonight, however, the pot-addled senses have their own ideas, and as you overtake your pile of cold Chinese food, your interest in the Friends is waning fast, their beat-perfect badinage dissolving into white noise with a slight Long Island accent. Pausing to fellate Cheeto dust off your fingers, you catch a glimpse of your own bowed reflection in the dead gray screen of your wood console Magnavox, atop which your working unit sits. A remnant of your childhood, the first box you ever watched, and are struck by a familiar, paranoid notion you've held since long before you were a perma-toasted hothead. That people behave differently when you're not around. You've always imagined yourself to be a kind of social antimatter, that any conversation you wander into is immediately dampened or quelled until you excuse yourself again. You suspect, no, don't sugarcoat it, you believe that real people who really care about each other in real life are every bit as codependently conjoined as the Gellers, Greens, Bings, Buffets, and Triviani's group hugging on screen. And they sit around hip coffee shops and impossibly unaffordable apartments discussing their personal lives ad over-caffeinated nauseum until all issues are resolved and all emotional ties affirmed. You're positive that these oversharing think tank conversations take place, that there are groups of people who spend all their time effectively helping one another regress toward the societally acceptable mean, and you're just as positive that you've simply never been invited. As the Friends give way to a string of noisy commercials, you start flipping channels again, climbing into the 3-digit jungle canopy of niche cable. You pass snippets of exotic flora and fauna, decade-old Queer Eye episodes, Canadian curling semifinals, senators debating in real time whether to declare August 12th National Take Your Gun to Work Day. Beyond that is a wasteland of condescendingly specified radio channels, jazz moods, urban beats, Latin fire, a note or two from each, blipping and bleeding into the next like some maniacally microsampled Matthew Herbert track, until finally, after minutes of rhythmic clicking, you're deposited into a calm blue screen ocean of premium movie and sports channels to which you do not currently subscribe. You'll see nothing but Lapis for the next 400 stops, but you click on, allowing silent, creeping dread to take hold. For people who smoke marijuana in responsible measure, paranoia is something of a winky cliche. They talk about how it makes them wonder if no one else in the room likes them, or think every exterior noise is the cops coming to batter their door down. They joke about it, like the Munchies, or tie-dye, or reggae, but they've likely never approached the kind of ingrained paranoiac sensibility prolonged THC consumption can forge in an otherwise reasonable mind. As an all-day, everyday adherent to the greenfold path, you do not wonder if other people like you or not. You take as a given that they don't. You revel in the knowledge that you're smarter than literally everyone you encounter in your day-to-day life, but also acknowledge that bumptious thought's half-empty obverse, that your day-to-day life is literally filled with idiots. Your coworkers take pride in their shallow work, forwarding their every unthink piece to their families and friends for fear no one else will read it before it's cast to the winds of disposable content. They see themselves as writers by simple virtue of the fact that they write words, and those words are published by persons other than themselves. This infinitesimal remove and light dusting of validation are enough for them to feel their place in the zeitgeist is secure. An outside observer might see you as doing much the same, but you rarely allow yourself to utter the words, "I'm a writer," in mixed company, instead answering questions about your job with self-deprecating jokes about plagiarism and prostitution. Sure, you've written plenty. Short stories, one-act plays, half of 2 novels, even some poetry, and mailed it off everywhere from the Iowa Writers Workshop to Cracked Magazine. But you don't believe you've earned the right to call yourself a writer. Not yet. Rejection takes a toll. You'd never in your life felt like you needed someone to tell you you were talented until 60 or so publications of varying quality bluntly suggested that maybe you weren't. It's been years since you wrote a word that mattered to you. Why bother? We're talking about a reading populace that's collectively decided YA is a genre rather than an age-specific comprehension level, and that only even tried to crack a Faulkner after Oprah recommended it. What reward even awaits true literary talent today? Total audience numbers that likely wouldn't get within shouting distance of your top 10 sluttiest rap videos parental control software doesn't block article. 46,000 views and counting. That's the world you write for now. It's vindicating, and on some base, simian level, even exciting, to generate that kind of traffic, to have your finger on the throbbing pulse, however briefly. But it doesn't make you a writer. Not in your book.